Good evening. My name is Cheryl Statham. I am one of the board members here at the Slate Belt Heritage Center. And until recently, and for many years, I was the Director of Education and Programming at Quiet Valley Living Historical Farm in Stroudsburg. I'm very happy to be here tonight. It is Women in History Month, and so that's what I'm going to be looking at. This talk, however, is not going to be focused on any one specific woman or women. Instead, I'm going to be looking at what life was like in general for women in America from the 1700s to the present day. I'm going to be trying to look at the big picture. As we look at the history of women, you should know that not one right or advancement in our lives was ever given to women. You hear that a lot, that the women were given the right to vote. No, they weren't. Women had to fight for every last law, every last bit of progress that we've made. We faced resistance from men and, unfortunately, other women. Even today, women fighting for equality find their most vehement opponents often are other women. So before I can talk about historical facts in regards to women's history, I first need to try and dispel a lot of the false ideas that people have in their heads about what life was like in the past. And the reason that is people have watched too many movies and way too many television shows that are supposedly set in historic times. Probably most everything that people think is true about our past is actually false. Movies and TV tend to portray life in black and white, and they also try to extract every bit of drama out of a story. Real life is infinitely more complicated and has more shades of gray. And you'll find as you start studying history, there are exceptions to every rule. Let's talk about movies first. Now, I'm not talking about documentaries here, of which there are many excellent documentaries. I'm talking about so-called historic movies. These so-called historic movies are, with rare exceptions, loaded with inaccuracies and flat-out lies. I'm going to lift up two movies by Mel Gibson, though maybe I shouldn't pick on him only because there's a lot. But two of his movies are notorious for the falsehoods, Braveheart and The Patriot. Braveheart was one lie after another, from the costumes to the language to the weapons, and especially the final battle in the movie. The Battle of Stirling Bridge had no bridge. It was idiotic. Also, The Patriot was one fabrication after another, ending with the Battle of Yorktown, which did not even bear any resemblance to the real battle. Television is also guilty about this. Two ones that I want to lift up are The Waltons and the Little House on the Prairie series. They're two examples of television shows that are full of historical inaccuracies, whitewashing, and false stereotypes. Especially when you look at the Little House show, people really came to believe that's what life was like back then. It isn't true. It never was true. The Little House books were written for children. Laura Wilder simplified and glorified the time period for her audience. She never meant for them to be historical fact, but that's been forgotten over the years. In the 1980s, life seemed so complicated to people, and they were scared of the future, and they were starting to yearn for the simpler times of the past. Those simpler times never really existed. Danger in all this, when people want to go back to a past that isn't real, is they start then fighting to get back to a life that never existed in the first place. We can see this playing out in our politics today, with candidates promising to return people to the better life of the past. So before I start talking about what life was like, I do want to do some debunking. There are a lot of really common historical stereotypes and ideas that are flat out false. Now, many of you watching this may not like this section, preferring to hold on to your false ideas. I actually ran into this several years ago when my husband and I were down in Williamsburg between Christmas and New Year's. If you've never been there, at Christmas time, it really is quite nice. And one night, my husband and I were in line to see a concert. We're waiting outside. It's a beautiful night, large Christmas tree on the green with lights on. And this woman said to my husband, "Isn't this beautiful? Wouldn't you have wanted to live back then?" Now, my husband is a smart aleck. And he said to her, "You should ask my wife that. She works at an historic farm." Now, I said I worked at Quiet Valley, which meant every day when I went to work, I had to wear a costume and work where there was no air conditioning and be out in the rain and all the bad weather. So she turned to me and said, "Wouldn't you wanted to live back then?" And my answer to her was, "No, not a chance." I said, "These nice roads here were not paved. They would have been dirt, meaning in the fall and spring they would have been mud. In the summer, they would have been dusty. When you get down the road, you've been covered in red dust. And in the winter, they froze and be in washboard. Animals were allowed to roam anywhere they wanted, so there was animal manure everywhere you went. And those nice privies with all the flowers over them stunk to high heaven in the summer. The work was never ending. It was brutal. It was an awful life." And she said to me, "Well, they didn't know any better." I said, "Yes, they did, especially in a colony like Virginia where there was an obvious leisure class that were able to be leisurely because they were rich enough to afford slaves. No, I would not have wanted to live back then." She was not happy with me. So let's take a look at some false stereotypes. Here's a biggie. People were more moral than they are today. They went to church every Sunday, they didn't have premarital sex before marriage, and generally behaved better than people do today. I want to read you a couple of diary entries. This first entry is from a woman named Martha Ballard. She was a midwife in Augusta, Maine. Well, Maine wasn't a state yet, but in the town of Augusta, she was a midwife for 40 years. This is one of her entries. "I was called at the rising of the sun to Sarah White, she being in travail, labor, with her 4th child and is yet unmarried." Let's read another one. This one is written by Abigail Adams, wife of our 2nd president, John Adams. This was written in Philadelphia in 1791. "When I come to this place again, I am determined to bring a decent woman who understands plain cooking with me. Such a vile, low tribe you never was tormented with, and I hope never will be. I have had in the course of 18 months 7, and I firmly believe in the whole number, not a virtuous woman amongst them all, the most of them drunkards. I recruited with a new one last Monday, but on Thursday she got so drunk that she was carried to bed, and so indecent that footmen, coachmen, and all were driven out of the house." Sounds so much moral than today. People did not go to church every Sunday, even if there actually was a church in the area. Many areas, especially in the frontier, did not have churches or a permanent pastor. They relied on traveling missionaries for a service in their home, and they'd invite their nearest neighbor to come to. They'd be lucky if that happened once a year. People routinely were together as a couple without being married. And they eventually would get married whenever a pastor happened to come through. There are many diary entries from traveling pastors of marrying couples with their many, many children attending the ceremony. Stereotype number 2. Men and women had very specific jobs divided by gender, and they only did these jobs. Most definitely not true. Gender roles were a lot more complicated than people realize today, and they changed depending on which country you came from, whether you lived in the town or on the frontier, and what period of history you're talking about. Until the 1900s, boys, all boys, unless you were extremely wealthy, learned how to knit, how to cook, and how to do basic sewing. Families were large in those days. Mothers could not do everything for their children. Boys needed to be able to make their own socks and mittens. They had to be able to cook meals when they were out hunting or at the maple sugar shack, and they needed to be able to mend their own clothes, sew a button on, mend up a seam, hem the pants. Girls also worked at all aspects of farm life, including taking care of the animals. However, different cultures did have different rules. People from England actually tended to care more about women only doing certain jobs, and the English also tended to only pass property down to the oldest son. However, on the frontier, those job divisions were often abandoned in the never-ending crush of the work. German settlers who came here had almost no division of labor on the basis of sex, and they would also pass property down to both sons and daughters. In my own family line, the first ancestor who came to this country settled in Stone Church, and he gave his farm to his oldest daughter, not son. Everyone had a farm for most of our history, even if they also had a business. And the workload on a farm is backbreaking, and it's never ending. It's a very hard way to make a living. So everyone had to help take care of the animals, plant the crops, harvest the crops, weed the vegetable garden during the growing season, chop wood, preserve the food, make soap, make cloth, on and on and on and on. Everyone helped with all the work. Large families were the norm, and children started to help by the age of 3. Next stereotype, women were the weaker sex and needed to be taken care of. Okay, have another reading. This one is again from the diary of Abigail Adams. Again, this is actually in Massachusetts, 1777. So this is during the Revolutionary War. John Adams is in Philadelphia. She is in Braintree, Massachusetts. This is her diary entry. You must know that there is a great scarcity of sugar and coffee, articles which the female part of the state are very loath to give up, especially whilst they consider the scarcity occasioned by the merchants having secreted a large quantity. It was rumored that an eminent, wealthy, stingy merchant, who was a bachelor, had a hogshead of coffee in his store which he refused to sell to the committee under 6 shillings a pound. A number of females, some say as much as 100, some say more, assembled with a cart and trucks, marched down to the warehouse and demanded the keys, which he refused to deliver, upon which one of them seized him by his neck and tossed him into the cart. Upon his finding no porter, he delivered the keys, when they tipped up the cart and discharged him, then opened the warehouse, hoisted up the coffee themselves, put it into the trucks, and drove off. It was reported that he had a spanking among them, but this, I believe, was not true. A large concourse of men stood amazed, silent spectators of the whole transaction. That doesn't sound like the weaker sex. In fact, if someone came to this country believing that idea, once they got here, they realized that really wasn't true. The weak did not survive. And I'm not just talking in the 1700s, I'm talking up to the early 1900s. The weak did not survive, only the strong did. Our ancestors were here trying to build a new life. They were starting with nothing, from scratch. Everyone needed to pull their own weight. Every girl expected to marry, but not necessarily for love. They looked for someone who would be able to provide for her and for their future children. Did he have a farm of his own, or would he be willing to come and work on her farm if she was going to inherit her family's farm? Was he a hard worker? Was she a hard worker? Young men in those days had to ask permission from a young lady's father before they could wed. That father would want to make sure that his daughter would be provided for. The groom's family wanted to make sure that the girl was a hard worker also, so that she could help her husband succeed. A suitor was allowed to look in a girl's hope chest to see what she had to contribute to the marriage. Marriage was an economic proposition, especially on the frontier, with women knowing that they could only be self-supporting by marrying. That said, in the 1700s, most people considered women to be naturally subordinate to men. It doesn't mean that men didn't trust women to take care of things. Who do you think took care of the farms and businesses when the men went off to fight during the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War? That's right, the women. They kept everything going until the men came back. Here's one you run into a lot. Life was simpler then and less stressful. Oh boy, how wrong can you be? People get this idea from television shows that show farms no one ever seems to have to work on. Life back then may have had less gadgets, but it was never easy, and fear was a constant companion. What were they afraid of? Failed crops leading to starvation and death, death of your children from an epidemic, death of a spouse or other family members, illness leading to death, Indian massacres, wild animals killing off your animals. Perhaps some weasels will get in and wipe out your flock of chickens. There'd go your eggs. And during wartime, especially during the Civil War, fear that the enemy army would come and take your animals and destroy your crops. Is that enough things to be afraid of for you? Next stereotype. Women did not work outside the homes. This is one you heard quite a lot in the 1970s. Any of you listening who were old enough to remember the 1970s, there was a lot of people saying women never worked outside the home, especially when women started to agitate for more openings in the job market. Here's the truth. Women have always worked outside of the home. Young girls routinely went out to neighboring farms and businesses to work for money or goods. In fact, Laura Ingalls was working outside of her family home by the age of 9 to raise money for her family. Women were working in the textile mills in Massachusetts in large numbers by 1800. Women were midwives and healers for their neighbors, and they were always paid for their work. They worked in shops as clerks if they lived in a town. It was also common for families to rent out rooms if they had a larger home, so travelers could stay overnight. Women had small home businesses selling products to local stores, to traveling peddlers, and to their neighbors. They were school teachers and nurses, especially from 1850 on. They drove freight wagons long distances and were also blacksmiths. The amount of women working outside of the home continued to grow as the country grew. During times of war, women ran their husbands' businesses until he returned and continued doing it if he did not return. One thing that is true then and is still true now, women always got paid less than men for the same work. Another stereotype, only boys were taught to read and write. This depended actually on where you lived and, believe it or not, what religion you were. A central tenet of the Lutheran faith was that everyone needed to be able to read the Bible for themselves. So everyone was taught to read and write, girls and boys. In this country's early years, every Lutheran church was also a school. They taught children during the week and adults during the weekend. Moravians also believed in equal educational opportunities. Moravians in Bethlehem were educating both boys and girls from the very beginning. By the 1830s, 1840s, most states that existed at that time were offering some form of free public education for any child who wanted to come. This is one we ran into a lot when I worked at the farm, this stereotype. Many women died from their clothes catching fire while cooking or from childbirth. Women did not die from their clothes catching on fire or their hair. All women wore their hair pulled back in a braid or a bun and under a cap. And clothes for all the 1700s and half of the 1800s were made of linsey-woolsey. That's cloth that is half wool, half linen. Wool cannot catch on fire. Also, women did die in childbirth, yes, but not in large numbers until the late 1800s, early 1900s. Martha Ballard, who I introduced to you before, she was a midwife in Maine from the mid to late 1700s. She delivered 996 babies in her career without losing one baby or one mother. That was typical of the time. Maternal deaths actually started to increase post-Civil War time period. After the Civil War, the fashion became that women had to have extremely tiny waist, about this big, all right? To get that, the only way you could get a waist that abnormally small was by corseting, severe corseting. 19 inches is what they wanted a girl's waist to be, 19 inches. Girls started wearing corsets by age 5. And what happened because of that is the rib cages became shaped like this instead of this. Hips became misshapen. All the internal organs were in the wrong place. So when a woman became pregnant and childbirth began, many times the hips could not open up. And this is when you see the large increase of maternal and child deaths, babies dying because of that. Next stereotype, farms were self-sustaining. Okay, now this stereotype actually has led to some dangerous ideas. A lot of people believe that our ancestors did not trade with other countries, and so we shouldn't do that today because we should only do what our ancestors did. Truthfully, there never was and never will be such a thing as a completely self-sustaining farm. No farm, no matter how large, can produce everything people would need. Farmers all raised at least one money crop that they could then sell to buy things that they could not raise or produce for themselves. They included iron cooking vessels like pots and Dutch ovens, iron bars that they could turn into nails, salt, very important, spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, sugar, fabric, leather, shoes, farm equipment like threshers and harvesters, plows. The list goes on and on and on. Farmers have been looking for other countries to sell their products to from the very beginning of our existence. Colonial farmers did sell some of their products locally, yes, but they also sold items to France, Spain, the West Indies, and Canada, which, by the way, made Great Britain very angry because they wanted their colonies to only sell their stuff to them. American farmers sold wheat to Russia in the early 1920s because they knew Russian crops had failed. America has always been part of the global economy. Next stereotype, people took care of themselves. They didn't take government help. Right, this nasty little falsehood has led to the demonization of people who receive help to buy food. And the Little House books are guilty of this. They have really contributed to the idea that our ancestors never took any government help no matter what. The truth is way more complicated. There's a book called Prairie Fires. It's a biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder. And in there, the author, by doing her research, found that for 2 years in a row, Charles Ingalls took government food when the grasshoppers ruined their crop. See, history is always more complicated than a television show. People died young back then. That's another stereotype. Half true, half not true. People who lived past the age of 5 could expect to live into their 70s, even in the 1700s. However, life expectancy for infants was not good for most of our country's history. Actually, life expectancy for babies did not really start to improve until 1940s. Few children lived to the age of 5. Most mothers expected to lose up to half of their children to some type of disease. Miscarriages were also common, especially as women grew older. There weren't any prenatal vitamins or birth control back then to space out the pregnancies. Most women were pregnant off and on for 25 years of their life. All right, so now that we've debunked a few stereotypes, let's look at what life was really like. Remember, there's exceptions to every rule, and I'm just doing a quick look. This is a very expansive subject. There's a lot to cover. So what I'm going to say is true, but you'll be able to find an exception to everything I say. And the reality is there's almost no rules for a large part of our history. Progress has always been uneven and unsteady, And with every forward move, pushback happens to try and push us back. In fact, we're living through such a time of pushback right now. So let's start in the 1700s. By the mid-1700s, all of the colonial laws are based on English common law, because by the 1700s, England controls the entire Atlantic seacoast. They own all the colonies. So what law there is based on English law. One important aspect of that law as far as women's rights is that women ceased to become a legal entity once they became married. And they also lost control of any of their property they brought into the marriage. However, in the 1700s, courts and lawyers were only found in large cities: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Williamsburg, Savannah, Charleston. Out in the more rural areas and the frontier, disputes were settled by community leaders and by common custom. German settlers who came here, especially those who were here in Pennsylvania, where there were a lot of German settlers, they didn't recognize English laws, and they routinely did what they wanted, what they did in the old country. German settlers routinely passed property down to their daughters, even if they were married, and the deeds would record the daughter, the woman, as the owner, and they would also be listed as the landowner in United States Census records once the United States became a country and we started doing once-a-decade censuses. One bright note, when we did become a country and the U.S. Constitution was written and then passed, the U.S. Constitution uses the term persons, people, or electors, which allowed future legal interpretation to include women as well as men. All right, so now we're moving into the 1800s. Country's growing. And as far as women are concerned, this is a century of great progress and equally great setbacks, depending on where you are in the country and where we are in the century in time-wise. So, remember that saying, go west, young men? All right? Remember that saying from your history book? The same can be said of young women who wanted more opportunity. The one great truth about the frontier, no matter where that frontier is, opportunity is for everyone. There are more things to do than there are people. So no one cares who does the job, just so long as it gets done. Women could do any job they wanted to or needed to do without criticism or harassment. By 1839, Mississippi had granted women the right to hold property in their own name. In 1869, the Wyoming Territory, this is before Wyoming became a state, the Wyoming Territory gave women the right to vote and to hold office. They did it again when Wyoming became a state in 1890. Why did they do it? Because the men in the state of Wyoming, they honestly recognized that the state would not have progressed as far as they did if the women hadn't come and settled and worked as hard as they did. They wanted women to have a say what was going to happen in the future. Wyoming also had the first sexually integrated grand jury in 1870. Wyoming became a very attractive place for single women to settle. After they did all this, civilization, in the United States history, civilization usually proves to be a bad thing for women's rights. The official right for women's right to vote began in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. 300 women and men signed the Declaration of Sentiments, based on the Declaration of Independence, urging the end of discrimination against women in all aspects of life. The fight for the vote will not succeed until 1920. Until after the end of the Civil War, so 1865, 1866, slavery still exists in half the country. Black women are not even considered human beings in the eyes of the law for more than half of the 1800s. In 1866, the 14th Amendment is ratified, concerning the right to vote. It specifically mentions men. It does not mention women. So women are still excluded from the right to vote. In 1873, the Supreme Court ruled that states had the right to bar a woman from practicing law even if she had graduated from law school. and there were a couple of law schools that were taking women by this point. Women still have no control over their own property once they marry in most of the country. Again, rules are a lot more lenient in the frontier areas, with many states trying to attract women to come out and help settle their states. The religion you belonged to also determined how much control you had over your own life and property. Some religions are really quite progressive, including the Quakers, the Shakers, and the Moravians. Others, like the Mormons, are extremely controlling and exercise almost total control over women's lives. There are, however, some important firsts in the 1800s. They're isolated and very rare, but they are a sign of things to come. The first female lawyer came from Iowa. In 1869, her name was Arabella Mansfield. Now, she didn't actually go to law school. She read the law. Until late 1800s, early 1900s in America, anyone could apprentice to a lawyer, men and women, if the lawyer was willing, and you read the law with him, and he taught you how the law worked, and he helped you learn how to be a lawyer. So Arabella Mansfield learned the law by reading the law. Ada Kepley was the first woman to graduate from law school. That came in 1870. In 1872, Charlotte Ray became the first African-American lawyer. Elizabeth Blackwell became the first female white doctor in 1849. Rebecca Cole graduated from the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia in 1867, making her the first African-American female doctor. By this time, by 1867, there are actually two medical colleges devoted solely to educating women: the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia and the New England Female Medical College. During the Civil War, women once again took over the running of the country while the men went off to fight. They ran the farms, kept stores, lumber yards, foundries, and other businesses going. They even took care of the cemeteries. If you've ever been to Gettysburg or plan to do so in the future, I encourage you to visit Evergreen Cemetery, the town cemetery for Gettysburg. As you go through the main gate, if you look to the left, there's a statue. It shows a woman, very obviously pregnant, holding a shovel. This statue is in memory and in honor of the wife of the caretaker of the Gettysburg Cemetery. Now, the husband had gone off to war. Gettysburg is overrun during the 3-day battle. There are bodies everywhere. She is asked to personally bury 100 bodies by herself when she was 6 months pregnant, and she did it. If you continue back past the statue and go around on the path, you'll see all the Civil War graves that she dug by herself. Women also became nurses during the Civil War across the country, and they took care of wounded on both sides. Down south, every large home became a hospital, with local women serving as nurses. Up north, women traveled with the Sanitary Commission. They would set up hospitals, triage areas, laundries, and kitchens to take care of the wounded. Believe me, no one was foolish enough to suggest that women were too weak to handle such work. During the 1880s and 1890s, the country, especially east of the Mississippi, became more civilized and settled. Unfortunately, that meant that women's rights contracted in equal proportion to how settled the country became. The idea that women were fragile beings started to become largely accepted during this time. When men came back from the war, those that did come back anyway, they took over jobs that the women had been doing. Queen Victoria's ideas on the family and women's roles in it were widely circulated and acted upon. So you have this really strange dichotomy, the end of the 1800s, that occurred between this idealized image of what women should be and the real lives of many women at that same time. American-born women were expected to stay at home, devote their entire lives to their family and to their house. They were to keep their own opinions to themselves and let men tell them what to do and think. At the same time, immigrant women and poor American-born women were working brutal hours in factories for pennies in extremely dangerous conditions. Farming, many women still farmed. Farming was still a dangerous occupation, and it was backbreaking. Women still worked alongside the men, although new farm equipment was making some of the jobs a little bit easier. So we move into the 1900s. We're moving along here. By 1900, all the states in the country have passed legislation granting married women some control over their own property and earnings. Note that some, not all, right? All would take a lot longer. In fact, in 1970, women still needed their husband or fathers to co-sign a loan, a car loan, or a credit card application because banks didn't believe that women could handle their own finances. By 1916, Margaret Sanger is trying to establish birth control clinics in direct challenge to the New York anti-contraception law. She'll fight for that right for 40 years. In 1918 in New York, a law was passed that allowed doctors to finally talk about contraception to their married patients. In 1920, women finally win the right to vote across the entire country with the passage of the 19th Amendment. However, Native Americans are not included in this. Native Americans, men and women, are not granted the right to vote until 1925. So when the U.S. entered World War I, they needed code breakers to decipher the enemy communications. Two of the best were Elizabeth Smith Friedman and Genevieve Hitt. Again, their male counterparts were paid twice what they were paid. Both women continued to work in code breaking after the war for various federal agencies, especially Elizabeth. She worked for the government for the rest of her life on code breaking. Again, she was recognized as one of the best in the field, but she never made the same salary as her male counterparts. World War II came. Again, a period of rapid expansion in available jobs for women. Once again, women were sought out by Army intelligence, Naval intelligence, and the OSS to break German and Japanese codes. There were almost 8,000 women code breakers by 1944. Women also moved into the factories, building ships, tanks, airplanes, bombs, ammunition, guns, uniforms, everything the armed forces needed. Other women worked in government offices in Washington, D.C., taking care of all the necessary paperwork the war generated. What was their reward once the war ended? They were shown the door because the returning soldiers needed their jobs. Men had families to take care of after all. Supposedly, women didn't. So once again, women ended up in low-paying factory jobs making consumer products like lighters, or in secretarial pools, or telephone operators, or the textile mills. The 1950s was a horrible decade for anyone who wasn't male and white. Women were told over and over again that the only job they should be doing is staying home and taking care of the kids and the husband. Articles told new wives that they should never share their problems with their husbands, should always be pretty when he comes home. TV moms always looked immaculate and they wore those stupid pearl chokers. Women who wanted to work or had to work found very limited choices. Store clerks, teachers, nurses, textile mills, telephone operators, line workers at a factory. It goes without saying that whatever job they did, they were paid less than their male counterparts. Things started to change in the 1960s as the country went through one of the most tumultuous decades it has ever experienced. The civil rights movement is picking up steam, gaining ground, and getting a lot of publicity on television. In 1963, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, which promised equitable pay for the same work. And I'd like you to note that word, equitable, not equal. It made next to no change in the pay inequality. Business owners found a reason to explain why women weren't actually doing the same job that their male counterparts did. Even today, women are not paid the same as their male counterparts. In fact, right now, as far as 2020, the average pay inequality is women get paid 81 cents for every dollar that their male counterparts make. Title VII in 1964 prohibited employment discrimination on the basis of sex. The Supreme Court in 1965 knocked down prohibitions on married couples using contraceptives. Yes, ladies, even if you were married before 1965, you couldn't use contraceptives. In 1968, the Executive Order 11246 prohibited sexual discrimination by any federal government contractor. These are just a few of the many state and federal laws that were knocked down by the Supreme Court because they discriminated on the basis of sex. Things heated up in the courts during the 1970s as the legal attacks on discriminatory laws continued. One lawyer that was in the center of all this, you may have actually heard of, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And later on to become Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Title IX was passed in the 70s. It mandated equal support for all aspects of education, including sports, in schools that receive any federal money. This one law, by itself, led to women's sports as it exists today. One of the most controversial cases of the 1970s came in 1973, Roe v. Wade, which gave women the right to a medically safe abortion. And I'm going to make some people mad here when I say, note this, women have been having abortions for thousands of years. The only thing Roe v. Wade did was guarantee women the right to have an abortion done by a medical professional in a medically safe environment. Laws were passed banning discrimination in the workplace against pregnant women. Women, you used to have to stop work at 6 months, when you were 6 months pregnant, right? Because after that it wasn't safe for you to work. Also in the 1970s, in a weird sort of equality, they set one drinking age for both men and women. In the 1980s, women's names were finally added to the draft. And this is when women started to enter combat and other major positions of responsibility in our armed forces. Also, finally, in 1981, the Supreme Court overturned all state laws that gave husbands control over their wives' property. It only took, almost 300 years? Organizations like the Rotary and the JCs were told to open up to women, and that went for law firms too. By the late 1980s, however, pushback against abortion rights was in full swing. The Supreme Court ruled in 1989 that states could refuse to use public funds for abortion and could prohibit hospitals from performing them. The Violence Against Women Act in 1994 was the first federal law that seriously dealt with and tried to help victims of rape and domestic violence. Although, as we all know, this is a battle that is still going on. During the 1990s, Title IX was expanded to include college athletics. Laws were passed to promote girls learning advanced math and science classes, and more laws were passed to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace. Again, another area we're still working on. So now we're in the 2000s. We're 20 years into it, and we've seen great advances and also great pushback against those advancements. The attacks against abortion rights are increasing and are succeeding in effectively ending abortion rights for women, depending on what state you live in. The Me Too movement exposed the amount of sexual discrimination and harassment that is still going on decades after laws declared it illegal. Women are still not given equal pay for equal work. Demonization of mothers with small children who rely on food and rent subsidies continue. They're called welfare queens and told that they're just lazy. Meanwhile, our country gives $28 billion to the oil and gas industry every year, but apparently that type of corporate welfare is just fine. Rights for LGBTQ plus people are being expanded, building on progress made during the 1990s. Marriage between same-sex partners became legal by federal law. However, violence against the same population of people are also increasing. The Equal Rights Amendment has still not been ratified. Those of you old enough might remember the Equal Rights Amendment. It was actually passed by Congress in the 1980s, but it still does not have enough states to ratify it into becoming an amendment. Who were the fiercest opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment? Phyllis Schlafly and her group, Stop ERA. A good example of how sometimes women are the strongest opponent to change. Pushback against all types of women progress can be seen everywhere, not just in our country. This is happening because more and more women are moving into leadership roles across our country and across the planet. Nancy Pelosi became the first female Speaker of the House in 2007. Hillary Clinton became the first female to run for president in 2008 and became the first female Secretary of State in 2009. Sonia Sotomayor became the third female and the first Hispanic American Supreme Court Justice in 2009, and Elena Kagan became the fourth woman Supreme Court Justice in 2010. There are female political leaders across the globe, including Angela Merkel in Germany. The ban against women being in combat positions was overturned in 2013. So there's definite pushback going on among members of the population, both male and female, fighting to overturn progress that they see as going in the wrong direction. They want to return us to this fairy tale make-believe time when men were in charge and women did whatever the men said. That time never, ever existed, which is why it's so important that more people understand the truth about our history. Now, I'd like to suggest, believe it or not, some books. Yes, books. I'm a believer in books. So one book you might want to read, especially if you're a Little House fan, is Prairie Fires. This is the biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder, and it definitely shows the truth about what life was like during her time here on Earth, and including how she got the books wrote. And it's very interesting. Another one, that's, if you're interested in history of World War II, Code Girls. This is a book about the contribution that women made to deciphering German and Japanese codes during World War II. Most of this information was only recently declassified, so this is also a really interesting book. I don't have a copy of it with me because I passed my copy on, but I would recommend reading Hidden Figures. You may have seen the movie, but the movie left a lot to be desired and left a lot of information out. So please read Hidden Figures. All of them are still in print and easy to find. Now this one you may actually have to go looking for. But if you're interested in the early history of America and the American women, this is a book called Domestic Beings. And what it is a book of diary entries from 6 different women who lived in the 17 and early 1800s and hundreds in our country. I would encourage you to go looking for it if you have any interest in early American history. So I hope that this at least gets you thinking, and hopefully it will get you reading. So please, take another look at history of America, at history of women in America. Thank you very much.